Have you ever wondered what life was really like for young women centuries ago, before our modern world even began to form? Have you ever stopped to think about how ideas, especially religious ones, shaped everything about their lives, from who they could talk to what they could own, to whether their voice truly mattered? Let's rewind the clock to a specific time around 880 and explore how some deeply held religious beliefs carved out a world where women often found themselves facing significant limitations. Number 1. The doctrine of divine authority and the male-dominated religious hierarchy. Imagine a world where the very idea of God's chosen representatives on earth, the interpreters of sacred texts, the leaders of prayer, and the keepers of spiritual wisdom were almost exclusively men. This was not a random coincidence in 880. It was a deeply ingrained principle, reinforced by centuries of tradition and interpreted as a divine command across many major religious traditions. The belief that God himself had established a male-centric hierarchy within religious institutions was perhaps one of the most powerful and enduring ways women's subjugation was maintained. If God supposedly decreed that men held the spiritual reins, then challenging that structure was not just challenging societal norms, it was seen as challenging the very will of the divine. This made it incredibly difficult for women to gain any sort of authority, to question their roles, or to even imagine a different way of existing within their spiritual communities. Across the sprawling Christian lands of Europe, from the Byzantine East to the nascent kingdoms of the West, the leadership of the church was entirely male. Bishops, priests, monks, and abbots held immense spiritual, social, and often political power. They were the ones who administered the sacraments, performed sacred rituals, interpreted the Bible, and guided their flocks. Women, no matter how devout or learned, were systematically excluded from the priesthood. This wasn't just a matter of tradition, it was codified in canon law and justified by theological arguments that dated back to the early church fathers. For instance, the selection of the 12 apostles by Jesus, all men, was often cited as foundational proof that spiritual leadership was a male domain. This interpretation meant that a woman could never stand at the altar, could never offer the Eucharist, could never hear confession, and could never preach to a congregation with the full authority of the church behind her. Consider the daily implications of this. A woman seeking spiritual guidance would always have to turn to a man. Her understanding of Scripture would be mediated through male interpretations. Her access to sacred rites would be dependent on male officiants. This created a profound power imbalance, not just in the formal structures of the church, but in the very fabric of spiritual life. The stories of revered female saints often highlighted their piety, their suffering, their obedience, or their miraculous interventions, but never their ordination or their direct leadership of a religious community in the way a male priest or bishop would. Even within convents, which were significant spaces for women's spiritual lives and learning, the ultimate authority often rested with a male bishop or abbot from a nearby monastery. Abbess might lead her sisters, but she did so within a framework that ultimately deferred to male ecclesiastical power. Her spiritual authority was limited to her own community, and her public voice was severely circumscribed. In the rapidly expanding Islamic world, the principle of male leadership in religious affairs was also firmly established. The imams, the leaders of congregational prayer in mosques, were always men. The ulama, the scholars who interpreted the Quran and the Hadith and developed Islamic law, were predominantly men. The early history of Islam, with the Prophet Muhammad and his immediate successors, the caliphs all being men, provided a powerful precedent. This meant that religious teaching, legal rulings, and the articulation of divine will were largely in the hands of men. While women could pray in the mosque, their space was often separate, and their voices were not meant to lead the community in prayer or public discourse. Think about a young woman in Baghdad or Cordoba around 880 AD. When she had a question about her faith, about proper conduct, or about her obligations, she would seek answers from a male scholar or a male religious leader. His interpretation, shaped by centuries of male scholarship and legal tradition, would be the authoritative word. This did not mean women were without spiritual lives. Far from it. Many women were deeply pious, studied the Quran, and engaged in spiritual devotion. However, their pathways to religious authority, to shaping doctrine, or to leading large communities were effectively closed off by a system that understood itself to be divinely mandated for men. The very structure of the mosque, with its mihrab prayer niche from which the imam led, underscored this male-centric authority. Even within Jewish communities, which had existed for millennia, the pattern of male religious leadership was deeply entrenched. Rabbis, the spiritual teachers and legal interpreters, were men. The leaders of the synagogue, the ones who performed the most sacred rituals and led public prayer, were men. Torah, the central text, was taught and expounded upon primarily by male scholars, while women played an indispensable role in maintaining the Jewish home as a spiritual center. Their public religious roles were limited. They did not lead services in the synagogue, nor were they counted in the minyan, the quorum of 10 adult males required for certain communal prayers. Imagine a Jewish girl in a community in the Rhineland or in Spain during this period. Her religious education would largely take place within the home, guided by her mother. But when it came to formal study of the Torah or participation in public rituals, it would be the men who took center stage. The interpretations of Jewish law, which governed everything from marriage to dietary rules, were shaped by generations of male rabbinic scholarship. This did not diminish the spiritual significance of women's roles within the home, but it certainly confined their influence and authority to the private sphere, while men dominated the public religious and intellectual life of the community. The argument for male leadership in religious hierarchies was often bolstered by the idea that men were somehow inherently more rational, more disciplined, or more spiritually capable of handling the profound responsibilities of interpreting divine truth. Women, in contrast, were often characterized as more emotional, more prone to temptation, or more distracted by worldly matters, making them less suitable for the rigorous demands of religious leadership. These characterizations were not just social stereotypes. They were often woven into theological discussions, giving them the weight of divine truth. When religious authority, the very conduit to the divine, was exclusively held by men, it created a powerful narrative that validated male dominance in all spheres of life. If God chose men to speak for him, to lead his people, and to interpret his will, then it seemed only natural that men should also lead in the home, in the legal system, and in society at large. This doctrine of divine authority, expressed through a male-dominated religious hierarchy, effectively closed off pathways for women's advancement and autonomy, making their subjugation appear not as a human imposition, but as a sacred order. It was a foundational belief that influenced all other aspects of their lives, from their education to their bodies, to their legal standing. Number 2. The doctrine of restricted legal and economic rights. Around 880 AD, the concept of individual rights as we understand them today was far from developed. Instead, a person's legal and economic standing was often deeply intertwined with their social position, their family, and, crucially, their religious community. Across Europe and the expanding Islamic world, religious doctrine profoundly shaped civil laws and customs, resulting in a systemic restriction of women's legal and economic rights. This meant that a woman's ability to own property, inherit wealth, represent herself in court, or even make contracts was often limited, placing her in a perpetually dependent position relative to men, whether her father, husband, or male guardian. This wasn't just a social custom. It was often presented as a divinely sanctioned order, reflecting a presumed natural hierarchy. In the Christian kingdoms of Western Europe, the legal landscape was a complex mosaic of Roman law remnants, Germanic customary law, and evolving church law. Despite these variations, a common thread was the general legal subordination of women. For instance, the principle of male primogeniture, where inheritance overwhelmingly favored the eldest son, was widespread, especially among the nobility and landed gentry. This meant that daughters often inherited little or no land wealth or titles directly. Their economic prospects were often tied to their marriage portion, a dowry provided by her family to her husband rather than to independent wealth. Imagine a young woman from a wealthy, noble family in what is now France or Germany. Her brothers would inherit the vast estates, the castles, and the titles, ensuring the family name and power continued through the male line. She, on the other hand, would be given a dowry, perhaps some household goods, clothing, and a sum of money, intended to help secure a suitable marriage. Once married, that dowry often came under the control of her husband. While some regional laws might grant a woman a dower, a portion of her husband's property for her use after his death, she rarely had full control over substantial assets during his lifetime, or even after. This system ensured that a woman's economic security was almost entirely dependent on her husband's management and her male family's goodwill. She could not easily acquire her own land, engage in significant trade, or accumulate independent wealth in a way that challenged the male control over family fortunes. Furthermore, a married woman in many Christian legal systems of the time had limited legal standing. She was often considered to be under the legal authority of her husband, a concept known as coverture in some later traditions, but the principles of which were already in place. This meant she might not be able to sue or be sued, enter into contracts, or manage property without her husband's explicit permission or representation. Her legal identity was often subsumed into his. While there might be rare exceptions or specific customs that allowed women in certain trades like brewing or textile production to operate with a degree of autonomy, these were generally within circumscribed limits and did not challenge the broader legal framework that branatized male control. In the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Christian realm, Roman legal traditions offered women slightly more property rights than in the West. A Byzantine woman could own property, engage in legal transactions, and often manage her dowry. However, even here her public roles were restricted, and the broader societal expectation was that men held the primary positions of authority. Her legal power, while present, was still exercised within a highly patriarchal social and religious framework that limited her overall influence and autonomy. In the Islamic world, the Quran and subsequent Islamic law or Sharia introduced specific rules regarding inheritance and property that were in some respects more progressive than contemporary European laws for women. For instance, the Quran explicitly granted women the right to inherit property, which was revolutionary for its time. A daughter typically inherited half the share of a son, and a wife inherited a specified portion of her husband's estate. A woman's dowry, the mahr, was also her property, given by the groom to the bride at the time of marriage, and she retained full control over it. She could own property, conduct business, and manage her own wealth independently, even after marriage. However, despite these economic rights, significant limitations existed in other legal areas. A woman's testimony in court was often valued at half that of a man's in certain types of cases. For example, in financial transactions or cases requiring the testimony of witnesses, two women's testimonies might be required to equal one man's. This was often justified by the argument that women were more emotional or prone to forgetfulness, though interpretations varied. While women could own property and engage in trade, their legal standing in matters of witness and public legal proceedings reflected a perception of lesser authority or reliability compared to men. This difference in legal standing meant that even if a woman had economic resources, her ability to fully exercise her legal rights or seek justice could be hampered by the unequal weight given to her testimony. consider the practical implications of a woman needing to defend her property rights in court or seeking justice for a wrong committed against her. If her testimony counted for less, or if she needed the corroboration of another woman to equal a man's single word, it placed her at a significant disadvantage. While a woman in the Islamic world of 880 might technically own her wealth, the path to protecting it legally or asserting her rights in public was often more difficult and precarious than it was for a man. Within Jewish communities, traditional Jewish law also placed restrictions on women's legal and economic autonomy, though with variations. Women could own property, and a married woman's property was generally distinct from her husband's. However, customary practices and specific legal interpretations often saw property passing through the male line. In matters of divorce, a woman was generally dependent on her husband granting her a get, a bill of divorce. While there were mechanisms to compel a husband to grant a get in certain circumstances, the power dynamic still leaned heavily on the male side. The ketubah, the Jewish marriage contract, was designed to protect the wife financially by outlining her rights and the husband's obligations, including a monetary sum to be paid to her in case of divorce or widowhood. This offered a degree of economic security not always present in other legal systems of the time. However, a woman's ability to initiate legal proceedings or to represent herself in a rabbinic court for most matters was limited. Her role was generally to be represented by a male family member or guardian. This meant that while mechanisms existed to protect her financial interests, her direct agency within the formal legal system was often curtailed, reinforcing the idea that men were the primary actors in public legal and economic life. These religiously informed legal and economic doctrines created a pervasive system where women's access to wealth, their ability to control assets, and their standing in the eyes of the law were often significantly less than men's. This was not a minor inconvenience. It deeply impacted their independence, their security, and their ability to shape their own lives. If a woman had limited property rights, she had fewer resources to leverage for her own endeavors or for the education of her children. If her legal testimony was devalued, her voice carried less weight in the public sphere. These restrictions meant that for many women around 880, their economic and legal existence was largely defined by their relationships with men, solidifying their subordinate position in a world where religious tenets often formed the bedrock of civil society. Number 3. The doctrine of domesticity and the subordinate household role. Picture this: from the moment a girl could understand, she was taught that her ultimate purpose, her most sacred duty, lay within the confines of the home. This wasn't just a social expectation. It was a powerful doctrine, often reinforced by religious teachings, that rigidly defined women's roles as wives and mothers, subordinate to their husbands, and primarily responsible for the domestic sphere. Around 880, this doctrine of domesticity profoundly shaped a woman's identity, her education, her daily routine, and her perceived value, effectively limiting her aspirations and opportunities to the walls of her dwelling. The idea was that a woman's spiritual fulfillment and societal contribution were best achieved through diligent management of the household and the raising of children under the authority of her husband. In Christian Europe, this emphasis on the domestic role was deeply rooted in biblical interpretations and the writings of early church fathers. The story of Eve's creation as a helper for Adam and the Pauline epistles that called for wives to submit to their husbands were frequently cited. For example, the verse from Ephesians chapter 5 verse 22, "Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord," was a cornerstone for understanding the marital hierarchy. This was not just a suggestion. It was presented as a divinely ordained structure for the family unit. The husband was seen as the head of the household, much as Christ was the head of the church, and the wife's role was to be his obedient partner in managing the home and raising children. Consider the daily life of a Christian woman, whether she was a peasant or a noble. Her days would be filled with tasks centered on the household: cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, textile production, spinning thread, weaving cloth, making clothes, tending to small livestock, and managing supplies. For noble women, the tasks might involve overseeing servants, managing larger household estates, and organizing social functions. But the core responsibility remained within the domestic sphere. Their education, if they received any formal instruction beyond basic literacy, would often focus on skills suitable for household management, piety, and perhaps some rudimentary medical knowledge for the family. They were not typically trained for public life, legal affairs, or theological debate. Their spiritual life was often integrated into their domestic duties, with prayer and devotion centered on family well-being and salvation. The Church actively promoted marriage and motherhood as the ideal path for women, often viewing celibacy as a higher calling for men, the priesthood, and for nuns, but only for those women who consecrated themselves to God and thus transcended the worldly demands of marriage. This doctrine of domesticity implicitly, and often explicitly, limited women's participation in public life, trade, governance, or scholarship. Their work was in the home essential, yet largely unrecognized in the public sphere, and their authority was confined to the domestic realm, always subservient to the male head of the household. In the Islamic world of 880, a similar emphasis on the domestic sphere for women was prevalent, though with distinct characteristics. Islamic texts and traditions, particularly the Quran and Hadith, also outlined specific roles for men and women within the family. Imagine a woman in a bustling Islamic city like Cairo or Damascus. Her life would largely revolve around her family and her home. While women in some regions might participate in local markets or certain trades, especially weaving or preparing food, their main focus was the household. The concept of purdah, or seclusion, though varying in strictness across regions and social classes, sometimes meant that women's interactions with the outside world were limited, further reinforcing their domestic role. Their social life might center around visits to other women's homes, often within family networks. Her education, if it extended beyond basic literacy and religious instruction, like memorizing parts of the Quran, would prepare her for her role as a wife and mother. She would learn about domestic skills, religious duties, and proper conduct within the family. While some extraordinary women achieved scholarly distinction in religious studies or poetry, these were exceptions, and they generally did not hold public religious authority. The focus on women's modesty and the protection of their honor, often tied to their purity and their confinement to the home, reinforced the idea that the domestic sphere was their natural and proper domain. The Hadith, collections of sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, contained numerous traditions emphasizing a wife's obedience to her husband and her reward for diligently managing his household. Within Jewish communities, the home was always considered a profoundly sacred space, and women's role in its maintenance was central to Jewish religious life. The concept of shalom bayit, or peace in the home, was paramount, and women were seen as essential for creating this spiritual and harmonious environment. Women were responsible for managing the household, raising children according to Jewish law, and observing the laws of kashrut, dietary laws, and niddah, menstrual purity, which transformed the daily routines of the home into acts of religious devotion. Consider a Jewish wife and mother in a community in Spain. Her day would be filled with preparing kosher meals, cleaning the house, lighting Sabbath candles, and teaching her children prayers and stories from Jewish tradition. While men were primarily responsible for public prayer and formal Torah study in the synagogue, women's contributions were considered equally vital to the spiritual well-being of the family. However, this division of labor meant that women's influence was largely confined to the private sphere. They were not typically expected to engage in the public intellectual debates of rabbinic scholars or to participate in the public leadership of the community. Their education, while emphasizing religious knowledge and moral conduct, was tailored to their domestic roles rather than to public leadership or advanced scholarly pursuits. pervasive nature of the doctrine of domesticity meant that for many women around 880, their identity was almost entirely defined by their family relationships and their functions within the home. This wasn't necessarily viewed as oppressive by everyone. For many, it was the natural order ordained by religious tradition and upheld by society. However, it effectively removed women from public life, limiting their access to education, economic opportunities, and political influence. Their contributions, though vital for the functioning of society, were often invisible outside the home, and their voices were rarely heard in the councils of power or in the shaping of public discourse. This strict adherence to the domestic role as a woman's primary divine purpose served as a powerful tool for maintaining their subordination, keeping them dependent on men and confining their aspirations to the private sphere. Number 4. The doctrine of purity and the control of the female body. Imagine a world where your very existence, your physical being, and your most intimate experiences were subject to a complex web of rules, rituals, and judgments, all tied to deeply held religious beliefs about purity and defilement. Around 880, the concept of purity, particularly as it applied to the female body and sexuality, became a powerful tool for controlling women's lives. Religious doctrines dictated everything from how a woman dressed, to whom she could marry, to her behavior during menstruation, to her sexual conduct. These rules weren't just about personal morality. They had profound social, legal, and spiritual consequences, often placing women under immense scrutiny and restricting their autonomy over their own bodies. In Christian doctrine, the emphasis on virginity before marriage and fidelity within marriage was paramount. The story of Eve, who brought sin into the world through temptation, was often interpreted to highlight women's supposed susceptibility to carnal desires, thus necessitating strict controls over their sexuality. The ideal of the Virgin Mary, pure and untouched, stood in stark contrast to the perceived dangers of female sexuality. This created a dualistic view of women, either saintly and pure or dangerously seductive and inherently sinful. Consider a young Christian woman in the European village. Her virginity before marriage was highly valued, directly tied to her family's honor and her own reputation. A breach of this expectation could lead to severe social ostracism, difficulty finding a husband, or even legal punishment. Once married, her fidelity was equally critical. Adultery, especially on the part of the wife, was often seen as a profound betrayal, not just of her husband, but of divine law. While husbands also faced moral expectations, the societal and legal consequences for a wife's infidelity were generally far more severe. The Church also developed elaborate rules around sexual conduct within marriage, often emphasizing procreation as the primary purpose of sex, thus restricting other forms of intimacy. Confessors would question women about their marital relations, further reinforcing external control over their bodies. The concept of ritual purity also extended to menstruation. In some Christian traditions, although not as overtly formalized as in others, there lingered older ideas that a menstruating woman might be considered ritually unclean, limiting her participation in certain sacred acts or physical proximity to holy objects. While this was more pronounced in earlier periods and varied regionally, the underlying sentiment that female bodily processes could be impure was a subtle yet pervasive way to reinforce women's perceived physical and spiritual fragility. In the Islamic world, the control of female bodies and sexuality was expressed through doctrines of modesty, veiling, and rules around marriage, divorce, and legal testimony. The Quran and Hadith contain verses and traditions that emphasize modesty for both men and women, but interpretations often placed a greater burden on women. Practice of veiling, for instance, which varied in its strictness and prevalence across regions and social classes, around 880, of protecting women's honor and preventing unwanted male gaze, but it also functioned as a visual marker of women's segregation from public life and control over their bodies. Imagine a Muslim woman in North Africa or the Middle East. Her dress would likely be modest, covering much of her body, and if she ventured outside the home, she might wear a veil depending on local custom and social standing. This was seen as a religious duty, a way to uphold her dignity and piety, but it also literally covered her physical presence from the public eye. Marriage was carefully regulated with clear rules for consent, dowry, and the husband's authority. While a woman had the right to her mahr, dowry, and could initiate divorce under specific conditions, the husband generally had the unilateral right to divorce his wife. This disparity in divorce rights meant that a woman's marital status, and thus her social and economic security, was largely dependent on her husband's will. Furthermore, legal rules around female chastity were extremely strict. Accusations of adultery or illicit sexual relations against women carried severe penalties, often requiring 4 male witnesses for proof, which made it difficult to prove, but the social stigma alone could be devastating. The emphasis on women's virginity before marriage was also paramount, and premarital sex was considered a grave sin. This created a powerful social and legal pressure to conform to strict sexual norms, with dire consequences for transgression. The purpose of sexual relations within marriage was generally understood to be procreation, and a wife's obedience to her husband in intimate matters was often emphasized. Within Jewish communities, the doctrine of purity, particularly ritual purity, had a profound impact on women's lives, primarily through the laws of niddah, or menstrual impurity. According to Jewish law, a woman is considered ritually impure during menstruation and for 7 days afterward. During this time, she and her husband are prohibited from physical intimacy. She also cannot visit the synagogue, enter certain sacred spaces, or engage in certain religious rituals until she has immersed herself in a mikvah, a ritual bath. Consider a Jewish woman in a village in Germany. Every month, her cycle would dictate a period of separation from her husband and restrictions on her participation in public religious life. While this was framed as a sacred law, and the mikvah immersion was a powerful spiritual experience for many, it also imposed a recurrent period of exclusion and control over her body. Her marital intimacy was regulated by these lunar cycles and ritual observances. The focus on women's bodies as sources of ritual impurity, even temporary and natural impurity, created a distinct set of rules that applied almost exclusively to women, reinforcing a perception of their physical being as needing specific regulation to maintain communal purity. Beyond niddah, Jewish law also placed a high value on modesty for women, emphasizing appropriate dress and conduct in public. Chastity before marriage and fidelity within marriage were strictly upheld, with severe social consequences for transgressions. While both men and women were subject to moral laws, the societal scrutiny and the physical implications of purity doctrines often fell disproportionately on women, making their bodies a site of extensive religious regulation and control. These doctrines of purity, expressed through rules on modesty, sexual conduct, marriage, and ritual impurity, profoundly limited women's autonomy over their own bodies around 880. They created a constant awareness of their physical being as something to be regulated, protected, and controlled, not just by themselves, but by their families, their communities, and religious authorities. Consequences of not adhering to these doctrines could be severe, ranging from social disgrace to legal punishment. This pervasive control over the female body, justified by religious teachings, was a fundamental mechanism for maintaining women's subjugation, ensuring their conformity to prescribed roles, and limiting their personal freedom. Number 5. The doctrine of female silence and exclusion from sacred spaces. Imagine a world where you are present in the most important communal gatherings, but your voice is systematically muted. Your opinions, your insights, your interpretations are not sought, and you are explicitly told that your role is to listen and learn, not to speak or teach. Around 880, but across various religious traditions, a powerful doctrine of female silence and exclusion from public sacred spaces served as a profound means of subjugating women. This wasn't merely about good manners, it was rooted in religious texts and interpretations that fundamentally limited women's public spiritual expression, their access to religious authority, and their participation. If your voice couldn't be heard in the places where divine truth was discussed and disseminated, how much influence could you truly wield? In Christian Europe, the most prominent example of this doctrine stemmed from interpretations of the New Testament, particularly the letters of Paul. "But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence." 1 Timothy 2, 1:1-12 were taken as divine commands. These verses were widely interpreted to mean that women should not preach, teach, or speak with authority in public worship settings. Consider a Christian woman attending Mass in a cathedral or humble village church. She would be expected to be silent during the service, except perhaps for joining in communal prayers or hymns. She would not be allowed to read from the scriptures, lead prayers, or deliver a sermon. Priest, always a man, would be the one speaking, interpreting, and guiding the congregation. Even if a woman had deep spiritual insights, vast knowledge of scripture, or a compelling message, the physical and spiritual space of the church, particularly the altar and the pulpit, was inaccessible to her voice. This enforced silence was not just about limiting speech. It was about preventing women from assuming any position of religious authority or public leadership. The message was clear. Spiritual authority and public teaching were the domain of men. Even within convents, which offered women an escape from traditional marriage and a path to deeper spiritual life, the public voice was often curtailed. While abbesses might lead their communities of nuns and offer spiritual guidance within the convent walls, their sermons or teachings rarely reached the broader public, nor did they hold the same ecclesiastical authority as male bishops or priests. The ultimate authority over convents often rested with male bishops or abbots, reinforcing the broader male-dominated hierarchy. This exclusion from public preaching and teaching meant that women were largely passive recipients of religious doctrine, shaped by male interpreters rather than active participants in its creation or dissemination. In the Islamic world, a similar principle of female silence in public religious leadership was widely practiced. While women were encouraged to pray and observe religious duties, their participation in congregational prayer was typically separate from men, and they were not permitted to lead the communal prayers or deliver sermons in the mosque. The role of the imam, the leader of prayer and often the deliverer of the sermon, khutbah, was exclusively male. Imagine a Muslim woman in a mosque in Damascus around 880 AD. She would pray in a designated area, often at the back, or in a separate section, away from the main male congregation. Her presence was accepted, even encouraged for piety, but her voice was not meant to rise in public leadership. While women could participate in learning circles and recount hadith, sayings of the Prophet, and some became respected scholars in their own right, their scholarship was generally disseminated within more private circles or through male intermediaries. They did not hold formal positions of religious authority that involved leading public worship or interpreting law for the entire community in the same way male ulama did. The expectation was that women primarily absorbed religious knowledge and practiced their faith privately or within the family unit rather than publicly leading the community in prayer or instruction. Within Jewish communities, the exclusion of women from public religious roles, particularly leading prayer and reading from the Torah in the synagogue, was deeply entrenched. Women were not counted in the minyan, the quorum of 10 adult males required for communal prayer, and they did not lead services, read from the Torah scroll, or become rabbis. While women could attend synagogue, their seating was often separate, and their active participation in the liturgy was limited. Consider a Jewish woman attending synagogue on the Sabbath. She would listen to the prayers and the Torah reading delivered by men. Her voice would not be heard leading the congregation, nor would she be called upon to offer a public blessing or to read from the sacred scroll. While women played an invaluable role in perpetuating Jewish tradition through the home and in raising religiously observant children, their public religious voices were largely absent. This exclusion was justified by long-standing interpretations of Jewish law and tradition, which assigned distinct roles to men and women in communal worship, placing men in the public leadership positions. The doctrine of female silence and exclusion from sacred spaces effectively denied women a platform for public expression of their spiritual authority or intellectual contributions within religious communities. It reinforced the idea that women were primarily listeners and followers, not leaders or teachers. This limited their ability to shape religious discourse, to challenge interpretations that might be detrimental to them, or to articulate their own spiritual experiences in a public and influential way. By denying women the space to speak and lead in the most hallowed settings, these religious doctrines cemented their subordinate position, ensuring that the narratives and practices of faith were primarily shaped by male voices and perspectives around 880 AD. Number 6. The doctrine of Eve and the burden of original sin. Imagine a world where the very act of being born female came with a foundational spiritual burden, a shadow cast by an ancient story that placed the blame for humanity's fall squarely on the shoulders of the first woman. Around 880, and in the Christian world, the powerful doctrine of Eve and the concept of original sin served as one of the most pervasive and insidious ways religious belief was used to subjugate women. This wasn't merely a theological debate. It permeated daily life, influencing how women were perceived, treated, and confined to specific roles, often with the underlying assumption that they were inherently more prone to sin, weaker in moral character. At the heart of this doctrine was the biblical narrative in the book of Genesis. Eve, created from Adam's rib, was portrayed as the one who first succumbed to the serpent's temptation, eating the forbidden fruit and then enticing Adam to do the same. Her act led to humanity's expulsion from the Garden of Eden and the introduction of sin, suffering, and death into the world. For centuries, and particularly prominent in the interpretations of influential church fathers whose writings shaped Christian thought in the Middle Ages, this story was used to generalize about the nature of all women. Consider the theological arguments that influenced Christian thought during this period. Figures like Augustine of Hippo, whose writings were foundational, emphasized Eve's role in the fall, viewing her as the weaker vessel, more easily deceived, and the instrument through which sin entered the world. This interpretation led to the widespread belief that women were inherently more susceptible to temptation, especially carnal temptation. They were often seen as dangerous temptresses, capable of leading men astray, much as Eve had led Adam. This view created a profound distrust of female sexuality and intellectual curiosity, associating it with sin and danger. Imagine a young Christian woman growing up in a Frankish kingdom or a village in Anglo-Saxon England. From a young age, she would hear sermons and stories that subtly or explicitly reminded her of Eve's original sin. This wasn't just a distant historical event. It was presented as a part of her innate being, a spiritual inheritance that made her morally vulnerable. This doctrine influenced her education, which prioritized modesty, obedience, and piety over intellectual inquiry or independence. Learning to read, if it happened at all, was often limited to religious texts that reinforced these ideas. The societal implications were enormous. If women were seen as inherently weaker and more prone to sin, then it logically followed that they needed male authority to guide and protect them. This justified male dominance in marriage, where the husband was considered the head of the household responsible for his wife's moral well-being. It also justified women's exclusion from positions of religious and secular authority. How could women, supposedly prone to deception and moral weakness, be trusted to lead congregations, interpret sacred texts, or govern kingdoms. The emphasis on Mary, the mother of Jesus, as the new Eve or the anti-Eve, served as a counterpoint but also reinforced the Eve narrative. Mary was presented as the ideal woman, pure, obedient, humble, and virginal. Her perfection highlighted Eve's transgression and set an impossibly high standard for women. While veneration of Mary offered a spiritual path for women, it also reinforced the idea that female goodness was defined by submissiveness, chastity, and a lack of independent will, in direct contrast to Eve's disobedience and curiosity. This doctrine also influenced how women were treated in legal and social matters. If women were seen as the weaker sex, they were considered less capable of independent judgment, and their testimony might be valued less in court. Their emotional nature, supposedly derived from Eve's impulsive act, was often cited as a reason for their lesser legal standing. The fear of female temptation also contributed to societal norms around women's seclusion and modesty, even in less strict forms than in other cultures. Women were expected to dress modestly and behave demurely to avoid inciting lust in men, effectively placing the burden of male sexual control on female behavior. While the doctrine of original sin and Eve's role in it was primarily a Christian concept, the underlying idea of women as morally weaker or more easily swayed was present in various forms in other societies as well. In the broader context of 880, this particular Christian interpretation of Eve was immensely powerful, because Christianity was the dominant religious force across vast swathes of Europe, shaping laws, customs, and social norms for millions. The doctrine of Eve, therefore, functioned as a powerful spiritual justification for women's subjugation. Painted women with the broad brush of moral inferiority, linking their very gender to humanity's fall from grace. This created a profound sense of inherent guilt and weakness, making it seem natural and even necessary for women to be controlled, guided, and disciplined by men. It was a doctrine that transcended specific rules about marriage or property. It was a fundamental theological statement about female nature itself, ensuring that women faced a unique and pervasive burden of original sin that limited their autonomy, their aspirations, and their place in society around 880.